Well,
It's
that
sort
sort
of
of happens with the cancel culture, doesn't it?
yeah.
You don't want to. You just, people don't want to hear you, or they think you're not worthy. People who work at a publisher, in this particular case in America, people who work at publishing companies will say, "We should not publish this person because I don't agree with, their values or whatever." I just think that's incredibly close-minded and tiresome and limiting.
Hello, my name is Donald, and welcome to WorldView. WorldView is a podcast where we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. If you've liked our content so far and enjoyed it, please consider liking this video, subscribing, and helping former President Zuma pay his legal fees. Today we're talking with Dominic Sandbrook. Dominic is a British historian, columnist, author, and television presenter. He is about to release a new series of history books for children, Adventures in Time, in July. Dominic, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be on.
So Dominic, I've seen many of your books. I've read as much as I possibly could. And one point of history that I want to focus on, a pivotal moment, is the Suez Crisis.
Okay.
Why is the Suez Crisis often seen as the end of British dominance?
Okay, so that's a great question, and a great question to kick off with. And so for people who don't know, the Suez Crisis is this moment when Egypt, which had basically been a kind of British-run protectorate for much of the 20th century, had become independent. And its nationalist leader, Colonel Nasser, decided that he wanted to nationalize what was the core Egyptian asset, strategic asset, which was the Suez Canal. Now, this is the mid-50s, so the Second World War is very, fresh in people's minds. And the Suez Canal had been seen as vital to Britain's interests in the world wars, and indeed since the 19th century, because it's this artery that links the Mediterranean with the Red Sea, and you can go to India. So it's this sort of crucial sort of world avenue, if you like. And for Britain in the 50s, the idea that the Egyptians would seize control of the canal, which was something that the British and French had basically built in the 19th century or paid for, it was a kind of affront to their to Britain's sense of its own imperial greatness, and the same with France. So what basically happens is that the British and the French cook up this scheme where they'll basically encourage the Israelis to start a war with Egypt, and then they will intervene in the sort of pretense of peacemaking, and they'll be able to send troops and secure the canal and regain control of the canal. And actually, militarily, the operation went pretty well. So the Israelis did attack, the British and French did give an ultimatum, stop fighting, and then just as planned, they attacked Egypt, and they were basically well on their way to securing the canal. But effectively, the Americans told them to stop, and the Americans said they would put pressure on Britain's currency, the pound, which was already pretty beleaguered. And Britain was facing effectively the threat of bankruptcy, I suppose.
And that was because the Soviet Union intervened, if I'm mistaken.
Right. The Soviet Union was the Soviet Union was basically going to end up sponsoring Egypt. And at exactly this moment, by the way, the Soviet Union has just is invading Hungary. So it looks really bad for the West that at the time when the Soviet Union is behaving very badly, two of the three kind of core Western powers really are also behaving in the eyes of the world pretty badly. And the Americans basically say, no, you've got to pull the plug. And Britain and France, particularly Britain, because its currency was weak, really had no choice. So they did pull the plug, and the operation was off. And for a country that for more than 100 years had kind of behaved with impunity, had done what it wanted, the country that had been, as it were, the bully, to find that it couldn't act on its own without American say-so, I think for the elite in Britain was profoundly humiliating. And so I think, or even though most ordinary people in Britain backed the operation, and actually when it finished, they forgot all about it pretty quickly and couldn't give a damn about it. But I think for the kind of great and the good, for people who had, if you think about it, there's a whole generation of people in 50s Britain who had been raised to run the empire, who had seen themselves as kind of proconsuls of a new Roman world. And to find that they couldn't do this, and that actually they were a bit more impotent than they had imagined, I think was quite a shock for them. For 20 or 30 years, there was this sort of ingrained sense of humiliation. And I think that's the moment um, that you can say the British Empire, that's the traditional moment that's been seen as the sort of death knell of the British Empire. And that's why it still kind of resonates in Britain today.
Well, what is interesting to me is why is it never considered the Second World War? Because I think even during the Second World War, the British dominance began to decline, and Attlee was just another figure in these talks. I mean, it was basically Stalin and Roosevelt. Why
Yeah.
is it considered Suez Crisis and not the Second World War?
Well, because we won the Second World War. So,
Okay.
The Second World War is perceived in Britain. I mean, the Second World War's position in the British imagination is colossal. The Second World War is the single sort of foundational moment of Britain's modern identity, because it's seen as the Britain standing alone, heroic cause, great crusade, all this sort of stuff. Now, lots of historians have written about this and said, oh, it's so much more complicated than that. Britain was never truly alone, blah 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 blah. But to the ordinary British man or woman, it is the war that sort of lies at the centre, I guess, of Britain's sense of itself, and the fact that, I mean, don't forget, the empire wasn't gone at the end of the Second World War. So India's about to go, obviously, but there's still a lot of colonies. So I think Britain didn't feel, a lot of people in Britain sort of thought, as actually all the European empires did, they thought rather sort of self-deludingly at the end of the Second World War, well, maybe we can turn the clock back and, maybe we can reinvigorate our colonies. And they didn't think, oh, the game is up, they're all lost, as we now know they were.
I don't know if you've watched The Crown, but there's, I can't remember the season, but they portray Macmillan as a sort of a betrayer of, I believe it was Macmillan, a betrayer of the Prime Minister after Churchill. He supported the Suez Crisis.
Exactly, Eden, yes.
Yeah, Eden.
Yeah.
Was it true? Did Macmillan support Eden and then backtrack on that?
Yes, first in, first out, I think people said of him. So yeah, he was all for it at first, and then he's the guy who says, "Oh no, we actually have to," because he's Chancellor of the Exchequer, so he's running the economy. So Macmillan's all for it. Oh yeah, great idea. Yeah, go for it. Let's teach the Egyptians a lesson I'll never forget. And then as soon as things get rough with the Americans, he's the first to say, "Oh, actually, I think we should call this off." And then he's very happy to basically stab Eden in the back and pick up the reins of power. When Eden's health, so Eden was a very sick man, and his health collapsed. I mean, his health is in bits throughout all this, and he's dependent on this sort of cocktail of drugs. And the Suez Crisis happens, and then I think they show a fair bit of this in The Crown. Eden's health.
Sorry, what was his illness? Because I don't think they ever explained in The Crown. What was wrong with him?
So he had various sort of stomach issues in the 40s, and I think it is, and he'd had operations that had gone. It was that classic story of when you have one operation, the operation goes really badly wrong, then you have to have another operation to fix the first operation, and then basically you're into this saga of endless operations. And the story is that the doctors, by sort of operation number 127, the scar tissue on his abdomen was so great that they basically took them a week to cut through all the scar tissue because he'd had so many operations already. So he's in pain. He's taking all these sort of stimulants and stuff. His health collapses at the end of the Suez Crisis, and he goes off with sort of uncanny coincidence. The place he goes to recuperate is Ian Fleming, the Bond book, James Bond creator's estate, Goldeneye, in Jamaica. So off he goes to Goldeneye to recuperate, and basically while he's away, the Tories, who are part of the government, they are sort of whispering in the shadows and stuff, and then he comes back and he basically has to resign because his health has collapsed. And it's Macmillan, who was all for the Suez Crisis, all for the Suez operation until he was against it. He's the person who basically ends up as Prime Minister.
So if we can move on a bit to Harold Wilson, what do you think of the man and his legacy?
Yeah. So for those people watching who aren't incredibly familiar with Harold Wilson is the Labour Prime Minister who comes in 1964 and becomes sort of emblematic in Britain of the spirit of the 60s. So he's He's from Yorkshire in the north of England. He's a sort of self-made man to an extent. He's not from a particular rich or sort of upper class family. Wilson is, I guess you can see him as a kind of early version of Tony Blair. So he's a modernizer. He seems youthful. I mean, he doesn't seem youthful to us, but he seems youthful to them. He tries to associate himself with the Beatles and stuff. And he's all about kind of remaking Britain in what he calls the white heat of the technological revolution. So basically, if you think of Britain in a very crude way, Britain in the 50s is this sort of very tweedy, old-fashioned, incredibly sort of conservative country. And Wilson in the 60s says, we're living in a new world, a modern world, and he wants to drag it kicking and screaming into this sort of shiny new era. And basically he doesn't. So I think that's the long and the short of it. Britain was by this point suffering from pretty serious economic problems. So if you take a very, very long-term kind of view, Britain had obviously had the Industrial Revolution. Britain had been the workshop of the world in the Victorian period, sort of churning out cogs that people used in every port in the world or whatever. And by the 60s, that was really running into, Britain's economic day had the sun had set, and we were losing a lot of market share, and companies were struggling compared with their German or Japanese counterparts. And Wilson, I think, found that was very hard to turn around. And there's also lots of conflict between the government and the unions in the 60s. So basically, Wilson's premiership that he had hoped would be this sort of great exercise in modernization ends up really being applying a series of sticking plasters, sort of crisis management, and sort of he tentatively trying to fix problems and then backing away from them because they're too difficult. And so, something that begins with very high hopes and this sort of sense of idealism, basically ends up being a sort of metaphor almost for sort of timidity and frankly failure. And that sounds very harsh because I actually really like Harold Wilson. I think he's a nice fellow. I often say, of all the recent prime ministers, he's the one you'd want as your neighbour. He's the one who would lend you, his hose. He's a sort of decent guy, but it didn't really work out for him, in my view.
Is it true that he only smoked a pipe to appeal to the average voter?
That's a very good fact. Yes, you've done your research. Okay, so exactly right. So Wilson is very crafty with his image. He very carefully calibrates his image so it's a mixture of kind of old and new. So on the one hand, he's wearing these sort of ludicrous shiny plastic raincoats, which are seen as sort of emblems of exciting modernity in the 1960s. And on the other hand, he smokes a pipe on TV, and you'll see him lighting up his little pipe in interviews, so that he looks kind of reassuring and old-fashioned that way, like an ordinary bloke who you'd see in the pub kind of thing, contemplating the woes of the world while having a pint and smoking his pipe. In reality, he smoked little cigars. So the pipe was a complete affectation, and it's a great example, actually. And wherever you are in the world, you'll recognise this of the way that really successful politicians use props and they craft this sort of image. I mean, Boris Johnson, our current prime minister, is a classic example. Margaret Thatcher with her handbag, these kinds of things. And Wilson had this pipe, which was his sort of common man prop. He's an ordinary person. And then off stage, ditch the pipe and get out his cigars.
So do you think Boris Johnson just does his hairdo just for the prop?
Of course, yeah. I mean, the great thing about Boris Johnson is such a fascinating political character because so much of it is an act. But one of the weird aspects of the act is that he doesn't disguise that it's an act, if you know what I mean. That you're all kind of in on the act, that you all know. I mean, this is part of Boris Johnson's almost his sense of politics and of history and of life, that everything is a great joke, that earnestness and seriousness he sees as suspect, and that life is a kind of black comedy, and that he will, that if you know he's joking and it's an act, and he knows that it's an act, and so on, and it's just this sort of hall of mirrors almost. where the real Boris Johnson or authenticity is not part of the, it's kind of not really part of the equation. There's a great story that a British broadcaster tells about Boris Johnson giving a speech, and I think it's a real key to his persona, giving a speech at an awards ceremony. So Boris Johnson arrives late at the awards. He gets up to give the speech. This is before he's prime minister. Some incredibly boring industrial awards. They've made the best, I don't know, washing up liquid or something. And so he gets up and his hair's all in him. He does his hair before he gets up, and then he sort of says, "It's a great, enormous pleasure to be here at the," and then he forgets what the awards are. And it's all an utter shambles. His speech is written on and the guy who was watching him said, "It's amazing how he's carried that off. He's turned up utterly unprepared." And the audience think it's hilarious and they love it. That he doesn't know what the awards are for and all this. Then a year later, the guy went to another awards ceremony for something completely different. Once again, Boris Johnson was doing the thing, and he did exactly the same performance, word for word. And it was all planned, and that's the sort of interesting thing. He's one of these people. There used to be, Winston Churchill used to practice his spontaneous remarks for hours in the mirror, so that his quips, so that they would appear. And I think Boris is the same way.
And Reagan had what do you call it? Notes. All his jokes were on notes, and
yes, exactly. All his jokes were prepared. That's the thing. It's the sort of appearance of spontaneity and of improvisation and authenticity, but it's all carefully manicured. I think that's what's so fascinating about politicians.
And I think they carried off because I think people in general consider politicians as a joke anyway. So it's not a big deal. It's
Well, I think what with Johnson, we had a long period in Britain of politicians who were very earnest and stage managed, and desperate not to put a foot wrong, always keen to say the right thing. I mean, Gordon Brown, who was our prime minister at the end of 2007 to 2010, he famously in an interview refused 10 times to name his favorite biscuit, his favorite cookie, because he didn't want to give the wrong answer. Well, that wouldn't be a problem for Boris Johnson. I mean, he would immediately give you some sort of rumbustious biscuit-based reply. And I think people, particularly people who are not interested in politics and who see politicians as annoying and corrupt and suspect, they love all that. They lap that up.
So if we can just quickly return to Wilson, he was considered a spy by some individuals in the UK.
Yeah.
That turned out to be false.
It did turn, and he thought the South Africans were spying on him.
Oh.
So yes, so there's a whole weird sort of subgenre of stuff about Harold Wilson. So it's true, Wilson had visited the Soviet Union on a sort of trade delegation in the late 40s, I think, and MI5, our sort of security service, had opened a file on him, as they did a lot of people, particularly Labour politicians who had any kind of links with the Soviet Union. They'd kept this file open. I don't think anyone, I mean, some cranky kind of people did say, "Oh, Wilson's a communist agent." And I think part of the reason they said that was that Britain was running into a lot of trouble during Wilson's time, economic trouble. So it became an easy scapegoat to say, well, the Prime Minister is a KGB agent. That's why, the economy's in sort of going down the tubes. I mean, this was obviously nonsense. But the weird thing is that Wilson knew about it, and it played on his mind. So he had two kind of conspiracy theories of his own. He wasn't a spy, but he believed that other people thought he was. And he had two kind of theories of his own. One was that the British security service was spying on him, which actually, there's some elements to it that probably they're at least monitoring him or keeping an eye on him. So he believed that they had bugs and stuff in the Downing Street portraits and kind of secret cameras and things. And towards the end of his time in office, when frankly he was losing his marbles a bit, he would sometimes take his ministers into the toilets and turn on the taps. So he'd say, we're being listened to, and they'd think, the Prime Minister, the Minister's mad, that he thinks this. And the other theory he had was that the South African intelligence was spying on him and had infiltrated Britain.
But I wouldn't be surprised if that were true, because we've spoken to Lord Peter Hain, and he was framed. They said by the the National Party. They try to
Yeah.
they set up an entire crime incident and try to implicate him. And it
Yeah, well, there
resulted
you go. You see, so Britain and obviously South Africa were close. I mean, their politics were closely entwined in many ways, and Wilson had always been he'd been critical of the South African government. He'd been critical of apartheid. He had this ongoing rift with Rhodesia, which had unilaterally declared independence when he was prime minister. And there's no doubt that the South African government did have people in London who were trying to discredit anti-apartheid activists and so on. So I think what the problem was that Wilson attributed them with more power than they really had, and he started to dream up. He claimed that he was constantly being burgled and that people were stealing papers from his office, and this must be the South Africans. I mean, I think I'm right to say it was called the Bureau of State Security, BOSS. I think BOSS is a very bad
yes.
moniker for an intelligence agency. It kind of makes you sound like the baddies. So these things, which were just a part of political life, and you just had to kind of get on with it, as it were. But they started to assume greater and greater importance in Wilson's mind. And by the time he left office in 1976, he was spending far too much time thinking about all these conspiracy theories rather than concentrating on the kind of nuts and bolts of government.
So, okay, so he was probably not a spy, but who were found to have been spies, like definitively? Who were spies of the Soviet Union in the UK? Do you know?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, famously the Cambridge spy ring. So, these guys who are sort of upper class, very well educated. Kim Philby is the most famous example. He was used as inspiration in some of John le Carré's spy novels. So there were people in the British kind of intelligence world who were communist agents, but they were most effective earlier. So we're talking about the 1940s, really, when they were handing secrets to their kind of KGB handlers. But by the 60s and 70s, I don't think it's actually as important. What the slightly confusing thing is that the stories actually only really come out afterwards, so that it appears at the time, and I think again this goes back to the point about things were going badly for Britain. So then you have these revelations about spy scandals that are sort of 20 years old. So it appears to people that the place is full of spies. The person sitting next to you on the tube is a secret communist agent, and this was obviously not true at all. But it created this sort of general impression of Britain. You see it, if anybody, you can watch them on YouTube, the sort of BBC adaptations that were done in the 70s, the John le Carré spy stories. And they're shot through with this kind of sense of shabbiness and seediness and kind of defeatism that was very sort of redolent of what the British elite thought of themselves and their country in the 70s.
Dominic, is your mic attached to your earphones? Because I think it's scuffing your.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No problem.
I'll just so now it should be a bit. I get too excited, and it kind of bangs against my shirt.
So if we can move on to Thatcher, what do you think of Thatcher's portrayal in The Crown? Because she came across to me as very stiff. I mean, I'm a great fan of Thatcher, and I've watched many of her debates and interviews, but she's not. She is quite a social person. She's not as stiff as she is portrayed in The Crown.
Yes, I think. So just on The Crown, I think The Crown's portrait of Mrs. Thatcher, actually, I didn't really go for it. I thought it was so mannered and so obviously kind of Gillian Anderson putting on her kind of Margaret Thatcher voice and all that. It didn't feel to me like a real living, breathing human being. It felt like a caricature, to be quite honest with you. So I thought it was much weaker than the portraits of the Tory politicians in the 50s with which The Crown started, which I thought were actually pretty good. And that's partly because I suppose when you're doing Margaret Thatcher, you're kind of in the shadow of her. She's so familiar that you just end up doing an impersonation instead of playing a real person. Now, as for the stiffness, Mrs. Thatcher, she was more. She wasn't quite as stiff as she's portrayed in The Crown, but it is true that when she was with the Queen, she was terribly stiff. Mrs. Thatcher was very deferential to the Queen. And I think people say, that their meetings were unbelievably kind of chilly and awkward. Mrs. Thatcher's not somebody with immense. social graces, and she's also somebody who's very much used to being the only woman and the kind of star of the show. So in her cabinet meetings with her ministers, she's the only woman, and everybody defers to her. And then when she's with the monarch, the dynamic is sort of unfamiliar to her. And people in Buckingham Palace said, she would go and they'd never seen anybody do such enormous, deep, long curtsies as she would do to the Queen. So there's a sort of element of truth in the Crown's portrayal, but I think it's so exaggerated that I found it quite hard to watch, actually.
And that period before she came to power, the winter of discontent, was it really as bad as it's portrayed? Like the electricity blackouts, the garbages being lined up in the street. I mean, it almost sounds as bad as South Africa.
Well, it was like that. I mean, that genuinely did happen. And so in 1974, we'd had the 3-day week where, because of power cuts, sort of shops and offices had been told to use electricity only for 3 days out of the week, and so a lot of them had closed the other days or used candlelight or whatever. We'd had a succession of strikes in the 70s, 2 miners' strikes, both of which the government had lost and the miners had won effectively. And then at the end of the 70s, we had what was called the winter of discontent, where basically all the public sector unions went out on strike against the Labour government, not a Tory government, against their own parliamentary representatives. And yes, exactly as you've said, there were these images of kind of, as you say, the people's bins not being emptied, so the rubbish piling up in the streets of London, in the centre of London, Leicester Square. Notoriously in Britain, I mean, every British person who watches this will have heard this a billion times, the dead going unburied. So corpses are kind of in Liverpool are stored in refrigerated kind of warehouses because the gravediggers were on strike.
Like the Black Plague.
Right, exactly. Kids being sent home from school, cancer patients being sent home from hospitals, these kinds of things. Now, the people who were on strike were very low paid. And so they sort of felt that, their pay had been squeezed and that they had no alternative. That's their argument. But of course, with the public at large, this played incredibly badly. I mean, the weird thing is the thing that really typified it in the public mind, apart from the dead going unburied, which is just such a sort of, tabloid friendly story, was people's bins. I always think British people, they care about dogs and horses and emptying of their rubbish. And the emptying of their rubbish probably looms the largest. And if it doesn't happen, that's curtains for a government. So these images of the bins being sort of unemptied absolutely hobbled the Labour Party for the next 18 years. And so it was against that backdrop that Mrs. Thatcher arrives in 1979. And her big message is, we have been in decline since the Second World War, and I will reverse it. I have a plan. I will do it, and I will do whatever it takes. And I think by 1979, enough people believed that message and were just sick of what they saw as the sort of saga of incompetence, that they were prepared to take a chance on the one thing that a lot of people thought would be unthinkable, which is a woman, of all people, as Prime Minister. And so in she comes in 1979, and then the weird thing is everything gets worse for the next few years. So she doesn't reverse it overnight. So the trajectory of her premiership is this sort of great narrative where it appears that she's basically plunged the country into an utter abyss, and then she comes out of it the other side.
Do you think some have said that she won the second election because of the Falklands and the split of the Labour Party into the Social Democrats? Is that a legitimate criticism? If it wasn't for those two events, would she been re-elected?
So the short answer is she would have been re-elected. I think the Falklands War and the split in the Labour Party between the majority of the Labour Party and then a small, more moderate, sort of more centrist faction that formed the Social Democrats. Both of those things definitely happened, and both of them helped her, I suppose. But I think she was always going to win a second term anyway, because, frankly, the country was very divided, but there weren't enough people who had lost out. So some people definitely lost out in her first term in office. Unemployment shot up massively. So Britain had by far the highest unemployment of any sort of major industrialized country. I mean, Britain was the absolute object lesson to most other countries in how not to manage your economy, or so it seemed in the early 1980s. But frankly, only 1 out of 10 people was unemployed, and the other 9 out of 10 were in work. And for lots of them, life was getting better. And I think a lot of people, because of the saga of disasters in the 70s and so on, a lot of people, frankly, accepted Mrs. Thatcher's justification that this was shock therapy, and it was the only thing that could reverse Britain's decline. So that's she says basically, I mean, she says it again and again. I'm like a doctor who, with a patient that has been neglected for far too long. And the only way I can get the patient back on his feet is to give him this incredibly harsh medicine. And a lot of people bought that argument. So I think she was always going to win in 1983. The Labour Party had swung massively to the left. And it basically, in my mind, and I think probably a lot of other historians, had made itself unelectable. The public were never going to back a party that was going to scrap Britain's nuclear deterrent, effectively pull out of NATO, massive nationalizations of businesses, abolition of the House of Lords, pulling out of Europe, all these radical changes at once. Nobody was ever going to back that. So I think she was always going to win in 1983. But of course, winning the Falklands War in 1982, made it much easier for her because she's transformed overnight. Yeah, makes a landslide. But it also works as a very convenient get out for her critics, because then instead of basically asking themselves the hard questions of, why is she popular and why have we failed to beat her, they can just say, oh, the public are idiots, and they just were swayed by the Falklands War. I mean, this is I think a constant problem for the sort of, well, frankly, for the sort of British left. And it has been, to sort of always look for excuses and to say, well, the public have been brainwashed yet again, this kind of thing. The public have been deluded by kind of bread and circuses or by foreign wars or whatever. And the Falklands is the classic example of that. Mrs. Thatcher won because people genuinely preferred her to the alternatives. But it was easier for people to say, oh, it's just because of the war. But I think she would have won anyway.
I believe it was Neil Kinnock that said he wished he had a war that would propel him to the prime minister position. He said, I think he is of the position that she only won because of the Falklands War.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's right. I think she would have won anyway. She probably wouldn't have won by as great a margin. But I'm, the polls were beginning to move back in her direction even before the Argentines landed on the Falklands. I think the Falklands War definitely gave her a new part to play, if you like, of the sort of patriotic hero who had led her country to victory against the odds. That was how her supporters portrayed her as sort of Britannia incarnate. But if you actually look at the data, and at the sort of the polls and at the kind of people who voted and so on, and the other election results, I think it's very hard to make the case that she would have lost in 1983. And don't forget, she wins another election without a war in 1987. So, I mean, it's not like she needs wars to win elections. She's perfectly capable of winning them without them.
So, Arthur Scargill, what is your opinion of the guy? And it's a common conception that he was a bit outmatched by Thatcher. Thatcher outplayed him. Is that true? Was he not really a match for her?
Yeah, your knowledge of British politics is very impressive, I have to say. So Arthur Scargill, yes, he's the leader of the National Union of Mine Workers. So after Labour have lost these elections, they've lost in 79, they've lost in 83. Scargill, who's the sort of leader of the miners, who's a Marxist, is a card-carrying Marxist, he basically says, we're going to have to break this Tory government through industrial action, not through sort of the ballot box. And Scargill has become the miners' union leader at the sort of in the early 80s, and he's made it obvious from the beginning that he wants a confrontation with the government. And actually, his members don't really fancy that. They don't want to give him it. So he makes these series of attempts, but they don't vote for it. But then in 1984, the government announces plans to, or the Coal Board, which is basically working for the government, announces plans to close a lot of pits, and this is the trigger that he needs. But he makes a catastrophic mistake at the beginning of the strike that I think made it impossible. Even though the miners' strike was the longest strike in British history, he he made a big mistake, I think, at the beginning of the strike that hobbled him throughout, which was he didn't call a national vote a national ballot. What he did was he said, we don't need one. Each area can just decide to join the strike. And if we have it as almost a series of area decisions rather than a national decision, then we won't need a vote. And he does that because I think he's frightened he'll lose the vote. But from that point onwards, the miners were always divided because some of them didn't want to go out on strike. So some areas didn't do it. So then you have this incredibly bitter confrontation for a year between the miners and the government. But yeah, Scargill was a charismatic speaker. He had great appeal to some of his members. The problem was he wasn't a very good general. So it's folly to start a strike in the spring rather than the autumn, because in the spring, the summer is coming and people don't need as much coal. So your stranglehold is not as powerful. Also, the government has spent years they knew this was coming, you see, because he basically issued so many threats. So they'd spent years building up coal stocks. So they had massive kind of piles of coal. So if the fact the miners weren't digging out any more coal wasn't a problem because they had these huge stockpiles. So again, I think that was a great tactical mistake. And I suppose the third thing and the biggest thing was that so much about politics is it's a fight for the centre ground, isn't it? It's a fight to say, I'm the voice of common sense, you're the crazy weirdo. And Mrs. Thatcher, divisive and abrasive as she was able to pose, I think, by and large, as the voice of the kind of silent majority in the miners' strike. And Scargill was too abrasive. He was too radical to win over, as it were, Middle Britain, people who didn't care. They blamed him and his violent tactics rather than blaming Mrs. Thatcher and the police. So he kind of lost the battle for public opinion. And I think at that point, when he had the divided miners' union, when the government had all these stocks, and when you've lost the battle for kind of the centre ground of public opinion, then he was always facing an impossible task.
So you mentioned the silent majority. I know you've also written a book about Nixon and American politics during that period.
Yeah.
What led to his sweeping re-election victory in 1972? Because that came as a shock to many people that he basically steamrolled all the states. What was that victory about?
Well, that's a great question. Golly, you've given me a good workout here, Britain and America. So Nixon's appeal. I mean, Nixon was because of the way his premiership is, it's still stuck in Britain, but because of the way his presidency ended, Watergate, he ends up being undervalued, I think, as a sort of pioneer of the populist conservative politics that we actually are very familiar with right now. So Nixon had won in 1968 as the law and order candidate, claiming that he had a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam, so secret he couldn't tell anybody. And in his first 4 years, they'd been very controversial, and yet, I think the left, again, his critics didn't realize how much they were playing into his hands with the anti-Vietnam War demos and so on. They actually often put off a lot of people in the sort of center ground of American opinion. And then in 1972, you have that writ large, and the Democrats nominate George McGovern. And McGovern's actually a very brave man. He's been a bomber pilot in the Second World War, very admirable man in tons of respects. But he basically is on the sort of much more liberal wing, so Bernie Sanders-ish wing of the Democratic Party. And he ends up being associated with a lot of kind of radical campaigns. So he's seen as people say he's the candidate of the 3 A's: acid, amnesty for people who've dodged the Vietnam War, and abortion. And that's not a great image for a candidate in early 1970s America. And Nixon, he says, I'm the candidate of the silent majority. If you pay your taxes, work hard, obey the rules, blah, 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 then I'm for you. And so he sweeps basically the nation in this crushing landslide. And it's a good example of how a conservative politician, by sort of staking their flag on the center ground, wrapping themselves in sort of patriotism, but also saying, I share the values of ordinary working people, not these sort of overeducated, long-haired weirdos, how they can win. I mean, the great irony of this, as you all know, is that it's this election that is ultimately Nixon's downfall, because it's in this election that you have the Watergate break-in. I mean, he didn't need to do it. That's the crazy thing. He was going to sweep this massive landslide, and the last thing he needed to do was any dirty tricks. But obviously, Nixon's own demons, the fact that he was so paranoid about defeat and about being, he remembered that he'd been beaten by Kennedy, and he was so desperate to avoid that. That sort of drove him into this sort of saga of criminality that ended up bringing him down.
So I recently watched a PragerU video. It's a conservative channel where they showed that Nixon was unfairly treated during Watergate. That, for example, President Johnson did the same, if not even worse. Is that a fair criticism? Was Nixon unfairly treated just because people didn't like him or the media did not like him?
Well, that is a very tough question to answer, actually, because it's both true and not true. So the not true is Nixon definitely was, involved with the Watergate cover-up. He had definitely encouraged his campaign aides and so on to do illegal things. He was on tape saying, break into this, find out what's in the safe, all this sort of stuff. He's also on tape talking about getting money to pay off the Watergate burglars. It's absolutely, so he's banged to rights, basically. There's no doubt about that. I mean, there's no way you can argue those things away. On the other hand, it is true that previous presidents, Democratic presidents, let's say, had not been, paragons of virtue. It's true that Lyndon Johnson was no stranger to dirty tricks. I mean, the taping equipment, just to give a tiny example, the taping equipment in the White House was installed under Johnson, not under Nixon. I mean, Johnson's very first election when he was, in Texas, there'd been all sorts of ballot stuffing. Nixon also probably had grounds to think that in 1960, when he'd made his first bid for the presidency against John F. Kennedy, that in 1960, there had been dodgy practices there, both in Texas and in Chicago.
They say the cows voted in Texas for the Democrats.
Exactly. So I suppose what you would say is this is par for the course in American politics to some degree. I mean, this is not, you can sort of faint about this and say how dreadful it is, but I mean, most hardened American polls knew this was how it worked. The other thing I would say, though, is that, in Washington in particular, people are not inclined to press this against, for example, the Kennedys in a way that they were against Nixon. There's a sort of element of elite opinion, if you like, in America that always thinks of Nixon as a parvenu, as kind of vulgar, as he's not as charming as Kennedy, and so Nixon, he never gets away with it. I mean, it's a dreadful thing to say, but he kind of looks like a crook, and people love to pin all this stuff on him. So for his opponents, they're delighted by it. Kennedy, of course, who had was no stranger to kind of illegality, but Kennedy has the kind of grace and charm and stuff that mean that people will forgive a lot of sins. I suppose it's a bit like, people will forgive, people don't. Bill Clinton was a charming, charismatic person. I mean, he behaved pretty abominably, but a lot of people were prepared to give him a free ride because they thought, Clinton is a bit of a dog, this kind of thing. But if he'd looked like Nixon, they probably wouldn't have given him the same leeway. So sort of personality, in a weird way, I think, plays a part in these things.
Yeah. If we can move it to modern times,
Sure.
There's a current movement to tear down statues and remove statues.
Yeah.
What is your opinion on that? Do you think there's a legitimate criticism to remove a statue because it's a racist figure, or?
So I don't really have an opinion about statues outside Britain because I don't think I'm qualified to do so. But certainly within Britain, I'm pretty fanatical about this. I don't think they should come down at all. I like living in a country that has layers of history. I don't have what I think is the sort of, frankly, the kind of very almost naive and childishly idealistic view that your history or your public history should just be this pantheon of admirable saints. I mean, that's not how people are. It's not what history is. I love the fact that I walk through London and, I do a podcast called The Rest is History. with my friend Tom Holland, who's also a historian. I think has been on your show, and we recorded a couple of episodes a week ago. They haven't yet gone out, where we were looking at all the statues actually, and we were kind of chuckling about them. They're all of kind of Victorian generals and things. But I love the fact that you walk through the centre of London and there's these visible layers and reminders of history. I don't think people are being expected to bow down and worship, General Sir Charles Napier. I mean, most people don't even look at the statue. But if you want to look, you can see, okay, that's what our forebears thought was worth celebrating. It doesn't mean that we have to celebrate it. And this idea, let's reorder our world, our landscape around us, in keeping with the sort of political predilections, and the sort of, frankly, the slightly sanctimoniously held views of the present. I don't buy that at all. I think, frankly, I think we should, as a generation, have a bit more humility. Of course, we can create our own things to leave our own legacy for our successors, things that we felt were important. But I think I'll make myself feel terribly virtuous by detonating they're never going to detonate. They always say, we're going to take and put it in a museum where we contextualize it. What they mean by that is they'll put it in the museum where nobody will see it. I wouldn't take anything down. Actually, I'm pretty extreme on this issue. If anything, I'd put more statues up.
Yeah, I think there's a fundamental problem with attributing today's moral values to the past. I mean, people just live differently in that time. I mean,
right.
majority. Yeah. I mean, you can't compare moral values of today to 50 years ago. It's just a different society completely. The majority of people, most likely during that period, believed what that person said or what his values were.
But even if they didn't, I mean, that's not. It's not, to me. It's not relevant. The moral lens. I mean, I don't walk around my local town with kind of my moral goggles on, inspecting the buildings and the public art to see if they measure up to my standards or the standards of people in the past or any kind of moral standards. I just think that's a weird way to walk around. I mean, the statue is there as a legacy of history. If I go to Rome, there's a bloody big building in the middle of Rome where people paid to go and see other people kill each other. And they fed Christians to lions or set people on fire and all this kind of thing. Now, you go to that building today and there's people outside actually dressed up as the people who did it, as gladiators and as Roman soldiers and stuff. There's kids kind of posing with them. No sane person goes there and says, I mean, maybe they do, I don't know. But to my mind, no sane person goes there and says, oh, this is absolutely ghastly, we should take this down and replace it with a shrine to kindness or something. I mean, no one wants to see that. We want to see the gladiators, we want to see the Colosseum. I think just an attitude of, what's the word? Just calming down a bit. And, history, it's great to live in a landscape where we have so many reminders of the past, where you can walk through the kind of relics of a vanished world. And sure, you can take them down, but then something will be missing. And it won't be as good, and you'll have basically cauterized a bit of your past. And I think, who wants to do that?
Yeah, I can't remember who the author was or the writer was, but there was someone in Germany that said, I believe in 1933, that if we burn the books, that's eventually going to end up that we burn people. And you can sort of attribute that to statues as well. If we remove statues, that can sort of end up with people being removed as well, who are not virtuous.
Well, that sort of happens with the cancel culture, doesn't it? You don't want to, people don't want to hear you, or they think you're not worthy. People who work at a publisher's, in this particular case in America, people who work at publishing companies will say, we should not publish this person because I don't agree with, their values or whatever. I just think that's incredibly close-minded and tiresome and limiting.
So I've mentioned in the intro, you're going to release a new set of children books in July. Can you tell us a bit about that? What is the topics? And
So the books are called Adventures in Time. They're published by Penguin, and they're written for kids. So previously, I've written history books for adults. I don't want to say adult history because that kind of sounds a bit dodgy, but I was a specializer in adult material before, and now I decided to write stuff for kids. And I don't really think many practicing historians have done that before. And the reason is partly because my son was studying, being British, of course, by law, he has to study World War II and think about World War II all the time. And so he was doing World War II at school, and we took him to the Imperial War Museum, which is this fantastic museum in London of the World Wars. And at the end, I said, I'll get you a book in the shop. He was 8, or was about to turn 8 at the time. And there wasn't really a kind of book that was right. And I said idly, somebody, I can't believe nobody's done this. And then the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, I could do it. And you could have a whole series called Adventures in Time. And they'd be aimed at kids between the ages of about 8 and 12. And it'd be a rollicking story, great characters, exciting cliffhangers, all this stuff. All factual. So the characters are real people, and everything that they say is what they said, and everything they do is what they did. And actually, there's this great landscape there of stories. I mean, that's why anyone gets interested in history in the first place as a child. You get interested because you like the stories and you like the romance of it and the drama and stuff. And I thought I'd love to have a go at doing that, and actually to write something that my son might actually read. And so the first one was on World War II, and I did one on the 6 Wives of Henry VIII, which is always a very popular story in England. And I've done the First World War, that's coming out in the autumn, and Alexander the Great. And I've just started work on, there's going to be 4 more. So Cleopatra, the Vikings, the Conquest of the Americas, and Napoleon. And then hopefully, if the series continues, I can do other stuff. I can do India, Africa. The sky's the limit.
I'm just trying to imagine. Is it like, is there pictures associated with it, drawings, and with captions?
So they're not like picture books.
Oh, yeah.
Just hold on 1 second. So, for people who haven't looked, this is the a proof, and you see it's like a real book. So there will be pictures, but it's like it's written in the same style. And for readers who are familiar, if you can read Harry Potter, you can read these. There are some illustrations, but it's a kind of it's a rollicking story, 300 pages, 20 chapters. Second World War one starts off with Hitler as the first character, and then we have Churchill comes on stage.
Oh, was he part of the Second World War?
Who's that? Sorry.
Hitler. No, I'm just joking.
Yeah. No, well, I mean, you know a lot about 60s Britain, but I didn't know that you knew about 1930s Germany. But no, they were really fun to write, actually, because previously I'd written these incredibly sort of densely detailed histories of Britain, kind of almost sort of day by day in the 60s and 70s. And this was something much more broad brush. It's great to be Alexander the Great riding into battle, or, kind of Spitfire pilots in the Battle of Britain or something. I mean, it's really good fun. And it was really fun to write them, thinking all the time, well, what does the child want? What's boring? What do they need to know? And how can I frame this in an exciting and readable and fun way? So, yeah.
That's great. I think a lot of people oftentimes use the excuse that, okay, I'm writing an adult book. That's just an excuse to make it complicated. And to make it for a child, it's you're simplifying it, essentially. You're making something that's complicated more simple. And I think that is, adult can read it as well. Why not? I mean, if it's simplified, I think it's
Well, I think part of the thing is when you're writing a book you're right. I think you can get lost in the intricacy. But you can also use the complexity as a bit of a shield. So that means you don't end up really saying what you think. You don't end up saying, what was the real cause of this? Why did such and such happen? Why did so-and-so behave in this way? Whereas you're writing for a child, the child doesn't want a lot of faffing around and, on the one hand, on the other hand. Which is what I've always spent all my sort of professional career doing from my PhD onwards. That's what you're sort of trained to do. The child just wants to know, why did the Second World War start? What did Hitler want? Who are the heroes? Crack on. So that's quite a fun way. I mean, you obviously try to introduce a bit of nuance. So one of the things in the Second World War book was to show, not all Germans, they're not the stormtroopers from Star Wars. There's more going on, and there's kind of resistance, and people have doubts, and all this sort of stuff. So it's sort of introducing that while you're still in a a child-friendly narrative, an exciting narrative. So that was really fun, actually, really fun.
Yeah, no, this has been an absolutely fascinating and interesting discussion. I want to give you a last opportunity to plug, add, or say anything that you want to.
Okay, well, if you like history, I think there are two things. First of all, pat yourself on the back because all sane people like history. But I think there are two things you should do. And one of them is you should try our podcast, The Rest is History. We have lots of good guests, but we do lots of fun things. Talk about, really sort of chunky subjects like the origins of the First World War or the French Revolution. Or we had an episode on Mohammed recently, for which miraculously we didn't get cancelled or any complaints or anything. But we also do fun subjects too. We had an episode on the top 10 eunuchs in history. We had a World Cup of ancient gods that people voted for. So the rest is history, and it's twice a week. That's our podcast. And if you have children, or if you know children, or even if you think one day you might have or meet a child, I strongly recommend that you pre-order my books, Adventures in Time.
Well, yeah, thank you very much, Dominic. If you've made it this far in the conversation, please consider liking this video, sharing it as widely as possible, and subscribing to our YouTube channel. This has been Donald, and this has been WorldView. Thank you.